people to welcome members, guests and members of the public and those both watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the EU working group, EU exit working group. The main item of business today will explore the effects of Brexit on London's EU citizens, employers and London's labour markets. But before we do that in our first section of the meeting, we will have the go-to organisation, if I can describe it, as the Institute of Government. And Joe, who's been before this committee before, just to give us, to set the scene of where we are in the latest position on Brexit, in relation to the EU. So, we've got some formal business to do. I just want to remind people that they can follow us on Twitter at the London Assembly or take part in the meeting discussion using the hashtag Brexit. Please make sure any electronic devices are switched off into silent mode. Can I just make some announcements before we move into taking any apologies for absence? We've got a number of a substitute here today for one of the members. So we've received two written updates from an event that was held by the Mayor of London in City Hall regarding EU citizens and advice, where over 1,275 people attended. And we'll receive those notes, we'll put them into our minutes. Our minutes are usually published in about a week or so's time, and people can read that report. We've also received a further written update from our colleagues from the London Resilience Forum, who are working within the national resilience issues in terms of preparing for no deal. We have a written response to that. Let's incorporate that into our minutes so that can go public as well. Now, any apologies that we've received?
Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Boff, for whom Assembly Member Devonish is substituting, and Assembly Member Whittle.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Tony. Okay, moving on to declarations of interest. Can I ask the members that we note the declarations have listed on the agenda, and do any members have any other declarations that they wish to make?
No, none noted.
Okay, let's move on then to item 3, which is the minutes of our last meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 5th of September 2019 are correct, so I can sign them off?
Agreed. Yes, agreed.
Thank you very much. Can I ask members on item 4, summary list of actions, can we note the report?
Noted.
And now can we go to our main items of business, our first section. Joe, welcome again. You're the Programme Director of the Institute of Government. Do you want to just take us through where we are in this strange and bizarre world of ever-changing circumstances of what we face?
Sure. I think every time I've seen you, there have been more options on the table rather than fewer. I think obviously the big thing is the general election. So we got here because the government got a new deal. There was some small in number but significant changes. I would kind of class the big changes in the deal as 3 things. One on customs arrangements for Northern Ireland in the case that no future relationship supersedes in the kind of backstop formation. The big change there was that customs, rather than a UK-wide customs union, which was part of Theresa May's deal, we went to a customs border in practical terms in the Irish Sea. So that was change number 1. Change number 2 is a kind of exit mechanism, which is a part of this new deal as called a consent mechanism, so an opportunity for the Northern Ireland institutions, after 4 years of these new arrangements coming into force, to vote on whether to stay in them or not. You will remember that the previous Prime Minister tried very hard to try and secure an exit mechanism from the then so-called backstop. I think one of the big reasons why this was possible in this set of negotiations is because the arrangements for Northern Ireland reverted to Northern Ireland only, so it was possible to give Northern Ireland institutions a voice in a way it would not necessarily have been possible where there were UK-wide elements. So that's change number 2, the exit or consent mechanism. And then the third change is the shape of the future relationship within the political declaration. The political declaration negotiated under this current government contains a looser form of relationship with the EU than the one under Theresa May. The best way to sum that up probably is in the words that replaced as close as possible or as frictionless as possible in Theresa May's deal to just saying ambitious under this one. So there were some differences there. So those were the three big changes. Legislation was brought through in order to implement that deal, and although passing second reading, the programme motion did not pass, and we are now to general election. In terms of what does a general election mean for Brexit, I think there are a number of interesting scenarios with no offence intended to any of the Assembly members. I think you can say broadly there are two outcomes of who ends up in number 10, most likely, Labour or Conservative. But as we have seen, who is in number 10 is important, but actually the numbers in Parliament on Brexit are also extremely important. And so for each of those scenarios, I think there are almost three sub-scenarios that are also worth thinking through for what they would mean for Brexit. So if we start with Labour and the potential for no Brexit, that is scenario one, a Labour government either through a majority or using through agreement with smaller parties, SNP, Liberal Democrats, whether it's a formal coalition or not. We know that the kind of one key policy that they will agree on will be the need for another referendum. That referendum, Labour's current policy is to be put a Remain option and also a Labour negotiated option. We don't know exactly what that means. We don't know whether that is changing the political declaration to include a closer form of future relationship, or whether they would want substantial changes to the withdrawal agreement, which could be a challenge in actually negotiating. But that scenario number one is that we end up with no Brexit after a referendum that probably at its soonest could take place next summer. We think that you need probably about 21 weeks to organise and run a referendum when you take account for the regulated campaign period, the need for the Electoral Commission to test the question. That has some interesting challenges on the EU perspective, because that is around the time that they will want to know the detail on their future budget for their next multi-annual framework. So some clarity about whether or not the UK plans to be in or out of that budget would be helpful to them, I'm sure. So scenario one is no Brexit. Scenario two is that referendum goes the other way, and there's a vote to leave on whatever the terms of Labour's deal is. I think if you were to guess now, and I could be proved very wrong in a matter of days, the ideal form of future relationship for Labour seems to look something like what was floated called Common Market 2.0, a combination of the single market and customs union, so a much closer form of Brexit. So scenario two is Labour leave. Scenario three under Labour is that we kind of end up in stasis, where although they can piece together a majority to form a government using smaller parties, we know that there are a number of Labour MPs, backbenchers, who are very against a referendum, and you would need to be able to pass legislation in the House of Commons to get to a referendum. So there is a scenario where we end up where the front bench of Labour is unable to carry all of the backbenchers, and they cannot get the numbers in Parliament for their key Brexit policy. It's sort of the scenario that Theresa May experienced a number of occasions, again, but for Labour. So that would be my three Labour options of where we could end up. Conservative government either, well, I think there are three different scenarios again. I'd say the first is that we could end up looking again at no deal in January, even though that is not the Conservatives' preferred option. It seems going into this election they are campaigning on the basis of a deal. If they need to rely on the DUP or possibly the Brexit Party in order to have a working majority in the House of Commons, it is likely that the negotiations around confidence, if you like, in the House of Commons will revolve around changes and maybe major changes to the withdrawal agreement. So that could reopen some of the things that had been settled by Boris Johnson and his government in the agreement over recent weeks, and there's a risk there that we could end up with no deal at the end of January. The second Conservative scenario is that they come back with a very small majority. This, I think, would mean it was very possible that we could pass the implementing legislation for the withdrawal agreement quite quickly in January and leave, but we then need to negotiate our future relationship with the EU, and I think the size of Boris Johnson's majority, if he is returned as Prime Minister, will essentially determine his room for manoeuvre in future relationship negotiations with the European Union. If it's a very, very small majority, he will have the same challenges as his predecessor of having to come up with something that keeps the competing, often, wings of his party content, with some MPs hoping for a close relationship, others a more distant one. So if there is a very small majority, I think you can say that passage of the withdrawal agreement bill might be successful, but there'll be some really tricky challenges on commanding a majority for any future relationship that is negotiated. And then the third scenario, and final scenario, would be that the Conservatives return with a large majority, which then gives Boris Johnson and the Conservative government more leeway in negotiations with the future relationship, because they can, to put it bluntly, afford to upset some MPs and still be able to get a deal through. I think, if you wanted to, I'm sure this will be poured over in coming weeks, but there will be some interesting possible changes in constituencies where the government that's returned may or may not have an MP. So, for example, at the moment, the Conservatives have a number of seats in Scotland that are all along the coastline. If the Conservatives are returned in government but without those seats in Scotland, would they be more open to doing a deal with the EU on fish that we know will be a big priority for the European Union? So I think whilst I've sketched through 6 very broad options, actually the makeup of the Commons for the future relationship negotiations could have a big effect on negotiating objectives and negotiating mandates. So I'll stop there. I think that's covered almost every possible Brexit.
And against all that background of whoever gets in, there are still other bits of legislation that still need to happen to unpick our relationship with the EU, and or the issue around the Lords, which isn't changing because the general election doesn't change them. And what do we know of the House of Lords is they are, one, they do look at legislation and they're not afraid to do amendments. And we've not seen that tested, have we, in terms of, well, we saw it in the early stages, but in terms of the latter stages of this period we've just gone through, we've not seen the House of Lords flex their muscle, if I can describe it in that sense, or their role as a revising chamber or putting through amendments. So am I right still that there's still a considerable amount of legislation that has to run alongside these negotiations, or even just getting through this interim deal?
Yeah. So I think we know there's this big key piece of legislation to get the withdrawal agreement ratified. In a scenario where we have a government after an election that wants to pursue a referendum, you would need legislation for that referendum. We legislate for referendums separately every single time. It took a long time for the 2016 referendum to be legislated for. You need agreement on the question, on the franchise. All of these things are agreed each time we do a referendum. But you're right, if we end up in a scenario where we do leave, there is a lot more legislation that needs to be passed that is Brexit related. So if you will remember the EU Withdrawal Act that was passed under Theresa May, which was once called the Great Repeal Bill. What that legislation does, as well as repealing the European Communities Act, is essentially copy and paste EU law into UK law. And in the areas where the EU has had competence, so immigration for EU citizens, fisheries, agriculture, what we are doing is copying over legislation, but ministers do not yet have powers to change that. So it's almost like frozen, like Pompeii, basically, from the second that we had left the European Union. And so they need to pass primary legislation in those areas in order to be able to subsequently change those regulations and rules and laws. So, for example, free movement, we know that if we were to leave without a deal, having not passed the immigration bill, free movement of EU citizens to UK would continue by law. The government had no deal plans for immigration that included something called temporary leave to remain, which I'm sure some of the later panellists can touch on. But because the immigration bill hadn't been passed, that would have been voluntary. There would have been nothing to force EU citizens actually signing up to EU temporary leave to remain. So yes, there's a lot more legislation to pass. On your point on the House of Lords, we did see the House of Lords quite, I don't want to say activist, because I don't think that's a fair way to describe the House of Lords, but there were a number of amendments that they pushed through, and they had some major concerns around the EU Withdrawal Act, the so-called Great Repeal Bill, because of the broad powers that ministers had taken, and they worked with the Commons and the Procedure Committee in the Commons to put in place some of the structures like the Sifting Committee to work out whether or not those powers should or should not be used, and the votes required in the Commons in order to pass statutory instruments. Taking that forward and where they might want to get involved, we know that the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, the WAB, the piece of legislation that Boris Johnson proceeded to second reading, and the government, took to second reading but then withdrew, that will need to pass in order for us to leave. The Withdrawal Agreement Bill, that piece of legislation, contains a lot of broad powers as well, and it will be interesting to see now that the Lords will have had more time to look over this, and lawyers will have had more time to look over this, whether the Lords put down more amendments, even if the government that returns after an election has a healthy majority in the Commons, whether the Lords ask them to think again on some of the procedural elements, particularly around the broad powers that will be taken.
Okay, any questions from my colleagues? No?
That's just, it's
well, thanks
really
again, Jo.
filling in.
Great.
Lots of scenarios, really.
Exactly, everything's on the table.
Yeah.
It's essentially the
Great
summary of
scene
my...
set up where we're going to.
Yeah, I think there's
But
lots.
equally, I think we can say whatever happens after this election, these real debates and sometimes constitutional issues are going to continue right the way through for some time to come.
I think that's definitely true if we are returned with a decisive majority in the House of Commons. We've seen a lot of people put some of the challenges in the House of Commons down to just Brexit, but actually it's a reflection of governing with a minority in a system that is based around a majority. So it will be, a lot of these challenges that have happened in Parliament and novel uses of parliamentary procedure may be much less common in the next phase of Brexit if there is a healthy working majority for the government of the day. Just in terms of one last point I'll make on the uncertainty is obviously the civil service are having to prepare for a huge range of options at the moment, and there's a big question, I think, about the extent to which no-deal preparations continue for January, because whilst all main parties will be going into this general election not supporting no deal, in some ways, if you look politically at where the main parties are, it's never looked less likely. It is still an option, and there will be big questions for the civil service to the extent to which they continue to invest in no-deal preparations. In some respects, that's made easier because the type of future relationship that this current government wants, in terms of practical things that are required on day one for no deal, are very similar to the practical things that are required for a deal with a much looser relationship. So there's maybe less of a challenge there, but communications for business about a possible January the 31st no deal exit, we know that those communications can't happen during an election campaign given constraints on civil service communications under the Cabinet Code. And I think there's also a question of the amount of people in Whitehall who have been shifted to work on no deal, both at the final months of Theresa May's premiership and then over the summer in preparation for no deal. Does that continue, or do we start to see, the hundreds of civil servants from the Department for Education who were moved to work on no deal planning elsewhere in Whitehall, do they start moving back, or do they stay there for a January exit? So it's kind of a smaller question, but some big practical considerations for the civil service in terms of how they think through this.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we So we probably might want you back in January.
Very happy to come
We're
back.
scoping out what we're going to be looking at, and one of the options is looking at the deal in much more detail and the impact
on London.
for Londoners, and we're having some business experts, but we also might well be working with some of our colleagues from the devolved assemblies. We've done some past work with that, even though we're not a nation in London. We have to remind ourselves of that, or a city-state. But nevertheless, we have done work with our colleagues in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So we might try and think that through as well.
Yeah, I think just very quickly, the Northern Ireland one is a really interesting question, given that they have been without ministers for the last over 1,000 days. And in particular, the changes within the new Irish arrangements as part of the Withdrawal Agreement will have a big impact. And actually, that envisages a new border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that needs to be in place by next Christmas. But we don't actually know the details of how it would work yet, because that still needs to be agreed during the transition. So yeah, very happy to.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Well, we're going to have a slight lull in our proceedings while our next guests are welcome to come down and take their seats. Do we want to go again?
Thank you very much.
No, I think we need to step
Don't go on silent, Tony. It's beeping.
Framework that out to do that. Be useful if I understood how to use these things.
What's this section called? The effect of the UK's exit from the EU. The effect of the UK's exit from the EU on users.
So welcome to our second sections, which is, in terms of, just want to read out the official title properly, the effect of the UK exit from the EU upon EU citizens. Can I welcome Alison Hunter for the Immigration Law Practitioners Association, Barbara Droitzvich, you've just stepped in at short notice, but we're really grateful that you could be with us, Chief Executive of the Eastern European Resource Centre, and Luke Piper, who's a solicitor for the 3 Million. Welcome. We've got a set of questions. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Caroline Pidgeon to lead off on those questions.
Thank you, and thank you for coming before us today. London is a culturally diverse, very rich culturally city, partly because we've got over 1 million Londoners from other EU nations. So from your experience so far, do you want to outline for us, for those who want to remain in the UK after Brexit, if Brexit happens, what are the issues that they are facing that you're hearing about every day? Who would like to? Alison, would you like to start?
So I would say that the bulk of people find navigating the system that they've got to go through to ensure that they have the right immigration status here relatively straightforward. That is what the government's saying, and I think that is broadly true. But that leaves groups on the edge which are finding it very, very difficult, and that even if it's only a small percentage, as the government keeps reassuring us, it's a huge number of people just because of the quantity of people. So I think the system is working, but we are beginning to see it now fracture at the edges. There are backlogs coming about. There are problems with people getting pre-settled and settled status, which is causing problems because of the long-term effects of that. And making sure they're getting the right status. There are also issues now arising around criminality and what's happening there. They just seem to be holding cases and not dealing with them. And then there are more minor issues with people not being able to scan their passports on the scheme, so the chip's not working properly and little things like that. What it is doing is causing a lot of anxiety. There are a lot of people who find it very stressful that they're not getting a document at the end of it. So they want a document, they want something to be able to show their status, and at the moment it's only recorded digitally. And so for a lot of people that causes a lot of problems. A lot of people don't have access easily to digital mechanisms of showing their status. Of course, a lot of people do, but then that still marginalises people. But even people who can deal with this sort of thing, don't understand how it's integrated with the chip in their passport, and how not having a document is actually not a problem if you can show your status, but they like to have something in their hands, so that's causing problems. Also, people are clearly, the support that's out there is quite good. There have been support mechanisms and groups set up to help people, but getting access to those is not always easy. So people are trying to do it themselves, and getting upset about it and not getting the right sort of support sometimes to be able to finalise the applications. So overall, the message that the government's putting out that it's going quite well, I think, is on balance not completely unfair. But what they're forgetting to say is that there are these groups, a lot of groups that are finding it far more difficult than they're making out, and we're still waiting for decisions on difficult cases because they're being stalled at the moment.
Thank you for that. Barbara.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I would just make a very quick sort of observation here that as my charity supports people who are disadvantaged, marginalized and exploited specifically, therefore I will be speaking on behalf of this particular demographics. It will not therefore apply to literally everyone. I would agree with pretty much everything that Alison did say. I would also add that there is, because British immigration system is probably one of the most complicated and complex ones in the whole world. People don't really realize that they already have immigration status, which is being a national of an EU member state, which is immigration status on its own. Therefore, it's sometimes rationalizing the fact that the settled status application is necessary for them to rebuild sort of or restructure relationship with the British state kind of requires going away to this level of abstraction. This is not easy, and it's not really at all intuitive for European nationals, I would say, on all, whether they are vulnerable or not, quite frankly. That doesn't help. It will also affect the way how people consume their settled status, which really is our key worry right now at this stage. Because in principle, I agree with Alison that the application system is kind of bumpy here and there, and maybe it could be done slightly better, and communication definitely could be improved from home office side and so on, but overall it is somehow being pushed through. The question is, how is that going to be used? We fear that there is some element of exploitation already happening with some T's and C's of employment being, for example, degraded for European nationals who fear that will have to leave or apply for some worker visa without understanding of this complicated various immigration instruments that are available now are possibly coming, and who knows what will be happening. And finally, my big worry really is, and I would be interested to see what Luke whether he will support my view or not, probably yes, is that my worry is that Brexit has become such extended process happening on so many levels, political, legal, social, economical, that it kind of my impression is that some members of European community don't see the threats of not being prepared for Brexit. It kind of is becoming like annual gas price increase almost thing that is just happening. Now I think that it will require preparation, and I think London will be affected by need of, for example, even if temporary, specialist interventions in terms of immigration advice about discrimination based on change of immigration status. That will be happening in particular with housing and employment, obviously. It might be health and social services might be elsewhere affected, because that's also part of immigration controlled kind of lot of activities people have to experience on a daily basis. And my understanding is that people are not really at all conscious that it is happening. We have two separate types of reactions, and they are kind of on both ends of the spectrum. One is that once I have settled status, everything will be completely fine. This is the only thing that is related with Brexit, without any consideration that actually there might be economic impact of Brexit, there might be some job losses, there might be loss of public funding for certain services we take for granted, whatever might happen. And then the other end of the spectrum is this very anxious, even severely anxious response where people are kind of panicking a little bit, considering whether we should to move our children from country to country or sell the house immediately. So there is no balance because there is no enough information because the situation is as it is. However, I think that probably there is a role for cities such as London being home specifically for people who are Londoners themselves or call themselves Londoners wherever they were born, to introduce element of kind of leveling this sense of bipolar reaction.
Okay, thank you for that, Barbara. Luke?
Yes, I think to come back to the question really that you began with there, which is looking at what specifically do EU citizens, what is their sort of, what should they be doing, and in light of the Brexit impact. And I think Alison began by talking about the need for EU citizens to apply through the EU settlement scheme for status. And much as the kind of initial point really is awareness of what people need to do, I think what there's a very clear pattern of is that a lot of people don't actually know what they need to do to solve their immigration issue in the UK. I think the starting point ultimately is that the consequence of Brexit is that people's rights of freedom of movement will end. And by virtue of that, that means people's rights to live, work, etc. in this country at some point in the future will stop if people are relying on freedom of movement. And the EU settlement scheme is a gateway, is a path to status so that people can stay and continue to live here. The first point that I would make is that there is a distinct, there is awareness of the scheme, clearly, because people are applying, but there is still a very large number of people who aren't aware and have a very confused perception of what it is that they need to do. So, for example, I'll give you two examples because I think they frame them quite nicely. A lady came to see me wanting to talk about her mother coming to the UK. She was Dutch, and I asked her, oh, have you applied for your status through the settlement scheme? Oh, no, I don't need to do that. That's politics. That's nothing to do with me.
Wow.
So I had to persuade her that this was something that she needed to think about doing. So that's one example. I think people are quite detached, and this leans on what Barbara was just saying, actually, which is that I think people's perception of what is going on is somewhat warped by the drama that is happening in Westminster. The other type of reaction that you often get is, well, this doesn't apply to me. I have my permanent residence, or I have a document already. So I delivered a session the other day, and this European citizen was there, and he came up to me at the end and he said, just to check, I've got this card. Do I need to do anything? And it was a EU permanent residence document, which is a document that represents EU freedom of movement status, which will be deleted by virtue of Brexit. So I think that's a really important point. That comes back down to really the government's awareness campaign and the issues that surround that, which I suspect you will have questions about later on. So I won't unpack my observations and my critique of that here. But I think that's your first thing. The second thing, and this leans on exactly what the other two were just discussing, and so I won't go into too much detail, but ultimately the journey to the acquisition of status for a lot of people is straightforward. I have to say, as a practitioner and somebody that works in an organisation that represents the interest of EU citizens, we often see things when they go wrong and when people get very worked up and very upset. And sometimes people do very strange things and they apply for things that perhaps they shouldn't be applying for, or they click the wrong button or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that people are struggling with navigating this process. And I think the other point, before I make a final point about this particular issue that we're discussing here, is that ultimately people have to interact with other services. It's not just the Home Office that people have to interact with come Brexit. They will have to pursue job offers. They will have to access the NHS. They will have to access housing from the local authority, etc., etc., etc. And these instances post-Brexit will require people to prove their status. And the various actors do not necessarily have the same knowledge or insight into how the UK immigration law works in this country as the Home Office might do. A small landlord or a small business may not be able to deal with things in the way that I think the government is hoping. And I think there's a lot of issues there, and hopefully people will be speaking in the panel later on will be able to speak more to the concerns that they have about employers' ability to navigate the post-Brexit landscape. And finally, and this I think punctuates the point really, and this leans on what Barbara was just talking about, is consequences. What are the consequences if people do not have immigration status after Brexit? And the government have been somewhat evasive and opaque about the details of this, and as time has gone by, we've managed to get more and more information, be it by admissions by Brandon Lewis to certain German newspapers, or by various impact assessments and other documents buried within various other legislative structures. But I think we can all agree that people will face the hard thrust of the hostile environment if they do not acquire the appropriate status. At some point in the future, that is a reality. And that means people's jobs will be at risk, people's ability to rent will be at risk, ability to access medical care and so forth will be at risk if they do not acquire status in this country. And I think there is a lack of perhaps honesty about that at a national level. I do believe, I think that is true. I get that they don't want to scare people, and I probably get accused of being a scaremonger saying these things, but that is the legal reality. I'm a lawyer, and that's what I work on. And on a day-to-day basis, I see people struggling now accessing services. And they have the rights now to access services without the need for status. So it raises the question, really, what is this really going to be like? And what can be done to prevent that from happening?
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. You've obviously the sort of people you're seeing through your work are people who are finding it probably more complex, finding the system not easy. Both Alison and Barbara, you touched on the anxiety people are facing, panicking. I think you used the word, Barbara. Are you seeing or are you aware of any rise in sort of mental health issues associated with having to apply to remain in the UK?
So I wouldn't like to directly say that, but I am sure there are. I mean, there are clients that I've seen in the advice session that was held here. I was giving advice, and I know that the woman had been in 3 times for advice to my colleagues, to myself, and was still not prepared to apply because she was so nervous about getting something wrong. And so we sent her to one of the charities that is being funded to do this type of work. She won't do it. She's got this complete anxiety about stepping up and giving her documents to the government that she's not doing it. So there are anecdotes like that. I'm sure it is causing anxiety, yes, but I wouldn't be able to document particularly.
I don't think we have any yes, exactly. I mean, I think we have data, hardcore data, proportion of. I would say that it's stressful experience. It is in particular stressful experience for people who are not used to accessing any advice and assistance because they feel they fail as people just by not being able to do the application that moves between mobile and online tools, because there is also change. It's not only on your laptop thing. There is also a section of people who are just traumatized by the fact of actually getting in touch with Home Office, quite frankly, on the line of immigration enforcement control sort of stress. And also there is a group of people who are really surprised that they have to do these things, and that also affects the way how they behave in relation to the responsibilities or the necessity of starting or doing application. Now my fear is that once we have people sort of applied for and situation is more or less settled, I have no idea, as Luke mentioned, how people will then behave in terms of accessing welfare, for example, because it is difficult as it is now, but it is less stressful, I suppose, maybe, in a way, because there isn't any one single document that we might have forgotten to have. So people technically are not excluded from the society. They might be if they fail with their application process or fail to apply, rather. And there is also, I think that there is also an element of generational kind of differentiation, so to speak. I think that older people do experience settled status application process much deeper than people in middle age or younger. But also we think that there are some sections, although I really cannot give you any data on that in some cases young people as well might be anxious because they might not understand their legal situation in the country, especially if that some children, many actually children that are born in this country to parents who have acquired residency prior to the birth will be registered as British citizens. And this is another quite common inquiry we receive. Well, my child has British passport. How do I apply for settled status? Why would you apply for settled status? So then people don't know really what to think about anything anymore. It's just, again, the many different immigration statuses that people can hold at once is not helping either. So I would say that it's just constant immigration advice is going to be an issue for at least a few good years to come, related only with change of this particular immigration status of this group.
Luke, what about the people you're seeing? Are you seeing a lot of stress and mental health concerns?
I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I won't speak to any diagnosis of this, that, and the other. But what people do say to me, I think there are a number of emotions. I mean, it's very complicated, actually. But I think at its heart is people are being told that you are no longer able to rely on something, and I think there is a great sense of betrayal actually amongst some EU citizens, particularly those that I work with. I do think people feel betrayed, and particularly when people were told during the referendum campaign that by those that are now in government that nothing would change, that their rights would stay the same, and that is clearly not what has happened here. People are now having to apply to stay in their homes. And I think there are those that feel very angry. I think there are those who are anxious, distressed, upset, and it does create a very wide range of emotions. Clients who have come to see me, some people who have instructed me, don't need to instruct me. They know how to work a phone, they know how to work a computer. But it's just the whole concept of engaging with the Home Office, and there's this heightened imagination, if you like, of what the Home Office is. Is this some kind of entity that they are afraid of? And some people are quite relaxed about it, others are less so. And I don't think we often, particularly immigration lawyers, are quite quick to sort of say, oh, well, you apply this, you fill in that, you do that. But that's because we deal with the Home Office on a day-to-day basis. We are used to them. We are used to the fact that people have to engage with them as an entity. For most EU citizens, a lot of EU citizens, they've never had that.
No.
And I often think it must be what it's like if you've never been self-employed before. You'd be baptism of fire in terms of what you need to do and how you need to do it. And I think there's that element as well, that people are now, oh, great, okay, I've got to do something, I've got to apply, and I've got to go through this process. So yes, I do think it's causing a lot of anxiety and stress.
Given the Windrush scandal, if I can call it that, recently, that probably will have unsettled some people if they've seen that, thinking, gosh, even if I did have the right to stay, I'm having to apply, I could be sort of kicked out, de-recognised, whatever. And that's a worry.
Yeah, I'll just, if I may, on that point, Barbara, because I'm always very quick to try and step away from the Windrush analogy, because I don't think that that's necessarily right. That's a particular group of people who've experienced a particular problem. But the consequences of what the Windrush generation and all of those people that are caught up in that problem have felt, there is a very real risk that EU citizens are going to face that because of the reasons that I spoke to earlier. And I do think the shadow of that has most certainly cast itself over this entire saga, and I think it will do for a very long time. But, the experience that those people had through the problems that generation experienced was horrific and horrendous. And as Yvette Cooper said in one of her select committee reports, she said, she asked me the question, I believe, if I remember rightly, she asked me the question, which was, are we on the cusp of a Windrush on steroids? And I believe I said yes, and I believe my colleague, Colin Yeo, said yes as well. Yeah. So, there is, I think there is a real risk to it, of it.
What I also think is very unsettling, so that people are considering going back to their home countries or moving back to Europe. So it's causing people who really thought that this was their home forever to rethink. And so people who have got the ability to enter another market to work or whatever are at least considering it to an extent which they wouldn't have done beforehand. And also coming in. We're not seeing as many people coming in. I do quite a lot of work with universities. There's definitely fewer people applying and wanting to come and work here.
I think, if I may share, just 2 points I wanted to add. One is completely obvious, but I need to say it. The European community in London obviously is not homogeneous. So it means not only the differences in terms of languages and nationalities per se, but also in the way how people experience immigration control in the past. So even in 2004 accession lot, so EU 8 countries, so-called, until 2011, I suppose, we had to submit worker registration scheme documentation to Home Office with every new employment within the first year. The 2007 extension, so Romanian, Bulgarian nationals, they had to apply for kind of like post-factum work permit. It's complicated, I don't really know much about it, but there was some relationship up until 2014. Now, if we compare this group of people who have some form of lived experience, like community lived experience of really recent immigration controls with very old, let's say, Italian community that might originate from post-war, whatever, prisoners of war kind of communities, whatever, they are in completely different mental place to tackle that head on. Now the second, I wanted to say something second, but I completely. So what I mean is that probably on practical level of sort of how people can be supported in the process of transitioning to different immigration status is to take that into account, that it's not the same lot and they will definitely have different experiences as communities. If you look at the fact that Romanian and Bulgarian community have been quite recently submitted to some form of immigration, not control necessarily, but relationship with, open relationship, explicit relationship with Home Office, that might explain why there is quite high percentage of application in those communities. It's over 50-60% of all counted communities in the UK now. Now, on the other hand, because these people have this experience, they will also they might be more likely to seek grey areas, so become invisible to the system simply for fear that something has not been done, there is some neglect or some omittance in immigration situation. So, which is again unlikely to happen with the West, sort of old European countries, because there is such an assumption that it is a freedom of movement, we don't have to fear anything. So I think that there is some logic in terms of end date, the deadline for application. I wouldn't be surprised if if all fail and our community efforts and the government and local authority efforts fail to support people in applications, that we will find ourselves those pockets of unregulated migration that should be regulated. There was no reason why, but it's simply because these different communities behave in different ways, but they are tagged as European family that has one single mind. It doesn't, and it has to be taken into account very strongly, I would say.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to move on to sort of information, advice and guidance. Do you think the UK government is providing suitable information, advice, guidance to support people to remain in the UK and to help them understand what their rights are now, what they would be in the future? Are EU nationals aware of the EU settlement scheme, etc.? Alison, do you want to go first again?
So I'm always quite surprised how many people aren't aware of the EU settlement scheme. And I have to say, if you walk around London where you think the advertising would be dense, I mean, I can think of 2 occasions in the tube that I've seen a poster which I've walked past and obviously not really read. So I think there are large groups who are not getting that information from the government. There is a lot of information on the website, but it's quite difficult to navigate, and there's different types of information. There are some quite good booklets, but you have to delve into the websites to find them, and actually it's quite difficult. What is working quite well, I think, now are the groups that have been funded, and charity groups have now geared up and are working very well together. So I work with one here in London, and they are now referring to the specialist groups which have who know about, for example, issues of criminality and that type of thing. So that referral system is gently working. But I think most of it is really people talking to each other. So Europeans telling each other, do you know, and it's sort of like Chinese whispers going out, rather than government information that's really hitting and getting to people. Once they know about it and they start delving, they will find stuff, but it does take a certain level of technical ability and literacy to be able to find the bits that you need. And so I think a lot of people are starting off on the application without any of that guidance and just hoping that they can get through it. And a fair number will be able to do that without actually needing any specific guidance. As long as they can find the app and then can continue through, they won't actually need a huge amount of guidance. I think if they do need guidance, then they're probably going to need help as well with some sort of advice.
Luke, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. I think the way to analyse this is to sort of break it up into parts. There is the public information campaign, which I would agree is less than visible, but I suspect that it's been rolled up in the Ready for Brexit campaign, which the government were pushing very hard. It is a very simplified message, but again, there's very little understanding as to the consequences if you don't do it. I appreciate the government don't want to run a campaign where they're saying these things, but you know that it is a point to be made. But I think what is quite important is that the focus at the moment is very much of the campaign when it is seen is to be very much on EU citizens. And for some people who benefit from freedom of movement rights, they are not EU citizens, they are non-EU citizens, so they are family members, so they're from outside the EU. And indeed, some EU citizens don't necessarily identify as EU citizens. They may identify as a different nationality. So, for example, some members of the Somali community that I've acted for, when you ask them what is your nationality, they'll say, I'm Somali. Or they'll say that they're their European nationality, but there's this interesting interplay between that. And there's some clients I've acted for who are from Guinea-Bissau, but they're actually Portuguese. But they see themselves as from Guinea-Bissau. They don't see themselves as, they view their passport as a means of getting into the country. So the information campaign is very much directed at those people who are EU citizens. I think that's quite an important point. The next to that is the actual guidance, the rules themselves, and the information that people use to be able to understand how they access the status through the scheme. I don't know how initiated you are with the immigration rules in this country, but well, I know Alison and I specialise solely in immigration law, and there is a very good reason why we just specialise in immigration law, because it's really complicated. And I mean, I looked at there is a suite of guidance documents related to the EU settlement scheme, and they total over 300 pages. When the Home Office are now publishing new rules, so the rules are, if you like, the mechanics underneath the bonnet of the car that make it work. When they publish changes to those rules, they replace them wholesale. So we have to go through them all and try and find out what's different. So it's not exactly user-friendly. And I think one thing that I will say is, and this is a particular concern that we've seen, Alison touched on it earlier, is that some people are being offered pre-settled status when in fact they are eligible for settled status. Now, I'm not going to go into too much into the semantics of that, but that is a really important thing, because somebody who's eligible for indefinite leave to remain, settled status, it's actually quite easy to get if they can get the proof together. But for some reason, there are multiple platforms of reasons as to why people are accepting an inferior status of pre-settled status, which is leave to remain, which means you have to apply for settled status at the end, and you must continue to meet the requirements of the rules. So I don't think necessarily in the campaign there's been that much clarity around these sorts of details. I appreciate it's an advertising campaign, you know, it's all about 60 seconds on whatever it is that they try and fit it all in, but I do worry that the ability to engage with the detail is not readily available.
Thank you. Can I just pick up with you on that pre-settled status point you made? Some of that's because people could not prove they've lived continuously in the UK for at least 5 years. What alternative proof could they present to the Home Office?
I think, well, let's just be really clear about how this works.
Yeah.
This is an unusual, this is a system.
I'm trying to simplify it then.
I
realise,
know,
as
but
you said, this is very complex.
I think what's quite important is that when you apply, there is an automated element to the application process. So when you apply, the government check your HMRC and DWP records, and they tell you, we have this data, we have this information, we'd like to offer you this status based on the records that we've checked. And if your records do not demonstrate you've been resident for 5 years, they offer you pre-settled status, which is leave to remain for 5 years. It's limited leave. There are various other rights issues that are associated with that, but they will present you with that offer. If you then wish to say, well, hang on a minute, you know, I want to have settled status, thank you very much. If you're, you know, confident enough to, you know, go on that journey, then the government will invite you to give further evidence by way of scanning and uploading that evidence to their website. And attached to one of this voluminous guidance documents is a wonderful annex with lots of examples of what you can use, and indeed that is reflected in part of the application process. But the fact of the matter is and some of those documents are quite easy to get, bank statements and things like that, and I'm sure Barbara will be able to wax lyrical in quite a bit of detail, more so than probably I could. But the fact of the matter is that people have to go on that journey. They have to acquire those documents. Sometimes they're not readily available, like, you know, picking them up and doing it. You've got to actively create this bounty of information that you need to present to the Home Office. And once you've done that, then they go on to make a decision. So there is this extra step, which is not insurmountable as such, but it is nevertheless an extra thing.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you. Barbara, do you want to comment on this?
Just a quick comment that, well, yes, indeed, it does look like that, exactly. So if people have access to advice and assistance, which assistance being basically doing the application for them, advice being interpreting the rules for them, it's okay-ish. Now, the problem we have, well, as we are recipient of a grant, of Home Office grant, supporting vulnerable people accessing the settled status application process, as well as 56 other organizations across the country. And I have to say that it is interesting experience, I suppose, right now, to reaching to people who are genuinely vulnerable, with vulnerability definition being slightly stretched beyond our standard vulnerability definitions. I would just say one thing, that the real struggle here is that that based on our own statistics, probably around 98% of all users coming through our doors, either be it during the outreach sessions or in our office settings, with various levels of vulnerability, let's call it this way, that might be slightly lack of confidence in English to tackle application to Home Office, all the way down to serious vulnerability. I would say 98% of people would request advice, always coming with whatever support you provide them, because there is no one single life that looks the same that can be sort of fit into those rules. That is the problematic issue for community sector, for charitable sector, but also for small businesses providing this type of advice, because immigration advice is regulated activity. It can't be just done by just anyone who can read and write in English, and rightly so, because it is complicated, and it has severe consequences for any future applications that people might wish to submit to Home Office. There is very limited capacity of immigration sector. I would say that does not require solicitor's presence or even further. So things like advice in simpler cases, that could be done by registered advisors. There is not that many of them. There is significant and growing under sort of unregulated environment for advice. It is criminal offense as well. and it's just the sheer size of it does not allow it to be fully controlled, quite frankly. That costs people a lot of money, because application to settle status that takes around 20 minutes in simple cases can cost anything between 200 and 650 pounds, which is extortionate, and it's just plain criminal, quite frankly. The problem is that we find it difficult to, as a sector, to expand this capacity without support. The Immigration Advice Regulator, Office for Immigration Services Commissioner, and their office, obviously, OISC, have certain set of rules that have to be met. It's quite just bureaucratic process, quite frankly, and then it's difficult, quite difficult for people who are not practicing advisors with many years' experience to pass exams and so on and so forth. So there is limiting element on capacity. That basically means that lots of people are going without advice, and they end up with having pre-settled status. That is, there are some cases where advice is just basically more needed than in others. So, for example, people who are leaving custodial sentences, prisons in other words, in some cases they might be eligible to apply for settled status, in others they wouldn't be because of the... It's complicated, I'm not going to go into detail. There might be cases of third country nationals who are in the process of divorce, for example, from their spouses who are EU nationals. It's all kind of really nightmarish. Now, I don't see there is any availability of really information advice, never mind information that is being delivered by Home Office. Home Office basically tells people to go and do it, so go and apply. But even the simple information, if you're self-employed and 6 months lapsed from your last tax self-assessment, you will not be visible in automated revenue and customs check. Therefore, you will have to submit additional information. It's just a paragraph that is not anywhere. You have to be told by advisor that this is the case. So it is really baffling sometimes from our point of view that so many decisions could be done the process could be so much easier for people who would have just much more thorough information and or possibly or both actually and access to advice that is regulated, but it doesn't need to be in depth, just need to be interpretation of just rules as they are now. So I would say we are still behind when it comes to capacity and need.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll pass back to the chair.
Okay, so we're beginning with Caroline Russell
Yes.
in the next set of questions.
So I just want to pick up on one thing that's just been covered in the previous bit, but just to clarify that about the confirmation that people get of their settled or pre-settled status, which is, I think, did I understand that's in digital format only? So presumably that could pose problems for people, and I think you have touched on it slightly, but I just want to see if there's anything else anyone wants to say on this. In terms of accessing housing, renting, bank accounts, and any other public services, is there anything you haven't said so far that you'd like to add on that?
Well, I think I can talk about that. So the way that employers, for example, will be able to access that is by going on, telling their employee or the person they want to employ to give them access to the digital status, and they will get a code sent to them, and the employer will then be able to plug that in and be able to see this screen, which has basically got a photo of the person on with all their details. So that will be the same then for people if you want to rent, etc. The problems that are going to arise are that you have to update, the applicant has to update their details. Everything is linked to their passport and their passport number. So if they get a new passport, they need to update the Home Office. If they change their telephone number, they need to update the Home Office because they are sent codes through on their telephone, like the banks do sometimes now. So forgetting to do this, which is going to happen, I don't know how often, is going to lead to real problems in the future. It's going to lead to employers having to stop employment for people because they can't check their status and things like this. So the knock-on effect of this is quite dire. And at the moment, the Home Office hasn't set up a system for people to be able to change their passports other than sending your passport in. Now, exactly. So tell an EU citizen that they've got to send their passport in, they look at you in horror and they're like, well, what do you mean? Now, I'm sure at some point they will change this, I presume, and they will get it in the same way that they can read the chip at the moment on the phone, and that information will be sent to them. But at the moment, they haven't got any plans, as far as I know, to do that. I'm sure they will at some point, but at the moment it's slightly dire.
So anyone with a slightly normal life,
Yes.
which means kind of changing a phone number or losing a passport and getting a replacement passport, that's automatically introducing barriers to kind of safety around your immigration status.
Yes.
I think it's very disturbing that it applies to public sector services as well as private. So DWP application, council applications for housing benefits, NHS in future, that will cover EU nationals checks as well. There is also this functionality, I'm being told, that has been opened for those other organizations. But again, I mean, the question is not only whether my 78-year-old user is going to tackle the system to basically apply for, I don't know, pension credit. The question is if a small employer or a landlord who might happen to be 78-year-old person is going to be able to tackle the system to check if I'm the person that can be employed or that can be rented, the flat or the house. Because sometimes my feeling is that conversations with government about these duties put on private people, so businesses like the landlords or employers, is that we are looking at multinationals having like a brigade of HR people dealing with this stuff. Actually, probably I'm quite keen to hear whether the next panel will mention that the number of small businesses that are being run by, for and with EU nationals in London alone is humongous. Mm-hmm. So if my duty will be to check everyone, my simple calculation will be, therefore I would rather employ someone where I understand what the stamp in the passport says. We are not having stamp in the passport, obviously. It is an issue that I see in terms of unintended discrimination that might become a problem for London, I think, not only from human point of view, but also from business point of view, where we are all in this together.
And do we know, for British citizens living in EU countries, are other EU countries coming up with similar systems to what the UK is coming up with for EU citizens, for British EU citizens living in other countries?
I will touch on that point, but I think, just if I may, close on your documents issue.
Yes.
There is a simple fix. Just give EU citizens and their family members physical documents. A government, I know, are very keen to trial this new digital-only approach, and they make very repetitive arguments as to why a digital-only status is a good thing. But it strikes me that to trial, because this has never been done before, I think that's really important to stress. This has never been done before, giving people digital-only immigration status. To trial that on several million people, and placing that in a bed of the hostile environment, which is what Barbara was talking about, is madness, frankly, and is going to create some serious problems going further down the line. And there are other things that need to be done that will make this, obviously there will be problems still with physical documents, but it strikes me that it's the lesser of two evils in the grand scheme of this framework. So I just wanted to kind of make that point quite clear. In terms of what our friends, those fellow citizens living in Europe are facing, well, yes, member states are establishing similar systems. Indeed, they have to. The terms of the Withdrawal Agreement are quite clear. They can choose between what is called a declaratory system or a constitutive system. What the UK has set up here, and indeed that's what it pushed for and negotiated very heavily for during the European elections, was a constitutive system. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you do not apply for the status, you don't get it, and then the consequences that we've talked about unfold. Whereas the opposite of that is a declaratory status, where a person's legal status is simply declared in law. So people who meet certain criteria are automatically acquiring their legal status. So the issue only therefore is providing proof, rather than just becoming unlawfully resident in the UK and being denied access to services and so forth. Those two systems are on offer under the terms of the Withdrawal Agreement. The UK government has chosen to go down the constitutive road. And there is evidence to suggest that other member states have decided, because the UK has pushed for this and because the UK is doing that, it will do that to British citizens living in member states.
Yeah.
And it is ratcheting up because of the no-deal threats that were going on. And we have seen that systems have been popping up here and there, but they haven't exactly been very as clear or as laid out as they have been here in the UK. But it is fair to say there has been an element of reciprocity, shall we say, in the UK's pursuit of the settled status scheme.
Just utterly worrying. I mean, imagining so many UK citizens who are living, have made their lives across Europe, assuming they had the rights of free movement. And yes, if the actions of our government are actually impacting on not only the people coming to live in this country, but also people from this country living abroad, that is massively increases the numbers of people who are
It is the nature of international trade, reciprocity. What you do to one person, they will do to another. It is a very basic principle in a negotiation. And I do believe, and based on the reports that I get from colleagues who live in Europe who are British citizens, that is playing a part, has played a part in the negotiations so far, and it's likely to play a part in the future negotiations.
Yes.
I was just going to add, I think, to one of the things that has been forgotten when this system was set up is how readily people have been able to move. People come here, they do a bit of work here, they go back, and we have this circular movement of a lot of people doing short-term contracts and work here. And this system has not been set up for those people at all. So all the frontier workers stuff, what I call frontier workers, where people are living in one place but coming in and working for short periods of time often, or I do some work for the Association of British Orchestras. They're very worried at the Opera House, for example, about how they're going to fly in the German who's going to sing for the night because the person that they had on, who was supposed to be singing has got a sore throat. They're not going to be able to do that. And this system doesn't, at the moment, account for that at all. Obviously, we'll get the immigration bill and we'll see what happens in the future. But that flexibility, that ability to come in, work for a short time, do something quickly, return, is going to be lacking in the way that it is now. And I think we underestimate, especially probably in London, how many people are doing that, how many people are coming in and out, working short periods of time. University lecturers who are living abroad but coming in and working at our universities full time, but they're very flexible, and those sort of things are going to become a lot more difficult. And if we were just to go back to the pre-settled status, sorry to go backwards, but one of the things about pre-settled status is you need to build up 5 years to get settled status. If you break your continuity, you won't get settled status. So if you stay out for more than 6 months in a year, you won't get settled status. And at that point, you're stuck. You've got nothing that you can actually apply for, because at the moment there are no categories in the immigration law which you'll be able to go into. So a lot of people who are living their lives by going in and out and being very flexible at the moment, who will have got pre-settled status, might hit a brick wall in 5 years' time because they can't actually move on to another status. They will have to then move into a status that we might get from the immigration bill, but we don't know anything about at the moment. So there are definitely knock-on effects from this system that haven't been completely thought through and are going to have effects on our economy.
Is there anything that you think the Mayor could or should be doing to ensure that those frontier workers, as you called them, can continue to work in London after January 2021?
So I think anybody who can apply for status should and gets pre-settled status. So people who are living in two places are able to apply and often will qualify, not always, but will be able to qualify. Apart from that, pushing the government knows if they've got a withdrawal agreement, they will have to do something about frontier workers. They know that. But I think this is something that people should be lobbying with. Companies who are using this type of labour should be lobbying the government now, making them aware that this flexibility is something that we don't want to lose. It's really, really important because it can be adopted into a new immigration system if we want, but it's much more difficult. And you can't, you don't have that sort of flexibility with Australia just because of the distance away, but you do need that with your closest partners who you're trading with, or that you want for cultural things to come in and that type of thing. So I think any pressure that can be put on the government to start thinking about this and start thinking about flexibility of workforce is important.
Yeah. Can I just go back to the protection of rights, both for EU nationals in this country and across the EU, things like pension rights. What does all of this settled status and the potential of people falling between the stools and not achieving settled status, what impact does that have on people's pension rights, both for people here in the UK and for people across Europe?
Yeah. So I think what's important to make clear is that settled status, and whatever status it is that you get through the scheme, is a immigration status. It gives you the right to reside in the UK, essentially, the right of residence. Pension entitlements and things like that are related but distinct in a sense. Under the terms of the Withdrawal Agreement, the UK is the coordination element between member states will exist for those that fall within scope of the Withdrawal Agreement, so those EU citizens resident in the UK before December 2020, and likewise UK citizens living on the continent. So under the terms of the Withdrawal Agreement, the architecture essentially remains, and that coordination function will stay in place. How that works and what that looks like, I haven't yet managed to scrutinise the Withdrawal Agreement bill, which essentially sets out how this will be dealt with. But if it's anything like the implementation of a citizens' rights element of Withdrawal Agreement bill, much of it is delegated away to the Minister to be able to deal with on their own. So in terms of insight into the mechanics, I'm afraid there's not much to say at this moment in time. But under the terms of Withdrawal Agreement, that coordination element would still exist. If there's no deal, and let's be clear, no deal is still a possibility. The 31st of January is just an extension of the leave date. Obviously, politically, there does seem to be more appetite for the Withdrawal Agreement now than there ever has been. But ultimately, there is the prospect of no deal. Then that coordination function isn't there, and the UK government would have to then pursue that with the member states.
Individually, 27
That's
relationships.
my understanding. That they would have to go to each individual member state.
Which sounds unimaginably complicated and undesirable.
We've not even touched on, healthcare coordination from the point of view of those British citizens living in Europe and how that's going to work. We're not here. We're not here to speak to the consequences of Brexit on them as much as I'd like to. But that's the whole point comes down to reciprocity. What is done here will be done to others abroad.
Yeah. I think there is also certain some sort of effect on pension. Pensions is something that people do think about, obviously, especially if they're actually quite young. And there seems to be quite a significant group of European nationals who might be considering leaving the UK for any European country within the EU. In case of no deal Brexit, simply because they don't want to be left without pensions. I mean, maybe it might be, or with worse conditions on drawing pensions in this certain. So that is a consideration in terms of workforce, for example, and kind of loss of talent, especially for London place. It would be something to think about. So I would imagine that needs to be, information has to be as provided as quickly to people as possible, so that they can make informed choice and not just bet on leaving the country because maybe they really don't have to.
Mm-hmm. Because if you go abroad, if you've accumulated your pension in the UK up to now and you go and live abroad outside the EU, your pension doesn't uprate, so it basically freezes. Now the government has announced that they will uprate if there's a no deal for up to 3 years. well, for 3 years, sorry. And beyond that, then unclear, and then they would want to have some negotiations. So for people who've lived here but want to retire and worked here and then want to retire abroad, that's not very attractive. So that, you know, people who are thinking in those terms, that will be something that puts them off if we go through no deal. And obviously, hopefully that won't be the case, and there will be negotiation and agreement on how to deal with these things. But as Luke indicated, these things, negotiating these things is a nightmare.
Yeah.
And particularly so if the reciprocity is
Down,
you know, set up by a kind of lack of good faith at this
the
end.
trust, yeah.
Just finally, sort of picking up on some of the sense of betrayal. I think one of you talked about the sense of betrayal that people felt, particularly around their rights. And I was contacted by an EU citizen constituent who was very worried about something that they saw in The Guardian on the 22nd of October, which was Jeremy Morgan QC saying that EU citizens merely had permissions under settled status rather than legal rights, because the scheme was a statement of executive policy of the government rather than law. This person was worried that that you know, these decisions, that executive power could be exercised at any moment, this way or that, without any public debate, let alone the need for democratic consent by the representatives of the British people. So, i.e., that this was giving a lot of power to the executive, to the government, without parliamentary with the potential for no parliamentary scrutiny for future decisions that might affect rights, like voting rights. And I just wonder if you have anything to comment on that.
Yeah.
Do you want to say about
Yeah.
legislation?
Well, I think a starting point is that, again, Alison and Barbara, we will speak to our experience as immigration lawyers. We are very used to living in a world where immigration policy is dictated by secondary legislation, negative secondary legislation, I might add, which is essentially, the immigration rules are a very unique creature in that sense, that essentially the executive, the government, can just change the rules at the flick of a pen if they wanted to. And that happens regularly and is the bane of my life, as is the bane of Alison's life, and every other immigration lawyer that practices in UK immigration law. That principle will essentially extend to EU citizens under the terms of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. It is essentially, what it does is it will allow the executive to make the decisions and amend and change things in accordance to how they wish to do it. And that's the structure of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. It uses Henry VIII powers to do that. I think what is important, though, is that rights of EU citizens would be in large protected under the terms of the withdrawal agreement if that is adopted, because the principle of direct effect would apply, and therefore EU citizens can rely on their rights directly to the withdrawal agreement if it is ratified and so forth. But the day-to-day implementation, the on-the-ground, enacting of the various structures, the rules and so forth, that will be solely the purview of the Crown, using secondary legislation. And obviously there are elements of scrutiny, but I mean, I think the last time that a piece of secondary legislation was defeated was 1973 or something, it's ancient history. So, in the grand scheme of things. So I think the concerns that people have about elements of their rights being sort of eroded and scratched away at by the use of these sort of executive powers is a legitimate concern, and is one that I hope those in Parliament, when the Withdrawal Agreement Bill eventually resurfaces in whatever government or whatever structure that we have, that these sorts of things will be scrutinised in the most appropriate and robust way.
Yep. So, sitting here now, to say to anyone who is an EU citizen living in London, you can't say solidly that their rights, say, to vote in the elections they currently have rights to vote in, will be protected going forwards, because we have the possibility of no deal. And
well, I think on voting rights, that's a very particular case because they aren't protected by the withdrawal agreement. So during the course of negotiations, that was made clear that that was a domestic competence issue. That was something for the UK to negotiate in the future. So voting rights do not feature in the structure of the withdrawal agreement. So it will be for the government to decide whether or not EU citizens will continue to have them. And I suspect that it will either require primary legislation or the use of Henry VIII powers. The legality of that may be questionable, I don't know, to be able to do that. But there have been discussions, and indeed by the former DEXU Minister Robin Walker did mention that this was something that they would like to have, for EU citizens to have after exit, but it would require reciprocity with those other member states, so for UK citizens to have the right to vote there. So in that particular case, you know, I obviously can't guarantee that voting rights will stay. It is the decision of, if it's, you know, in the scope of the government to decide, then so be it, but then it'd be Parliament to decide if it's not within the scope of that. But there are various other things that could be changed. I think, for example, say withdrawal agreement does go through, for example, those that are protected by it are those who are working and exercising their treaty rights. The government has been more generous and included a lot more people who are eligible to apply to stay in this country, and they could, if they wanted to, change that. And there is a risk to that.
Okay. Look, this is a considerable matter for a number of Londoners that we need to go into battle for. I'm thinking that when we either write to the Mayor, we may have a discussion outside this meeting, that we consider that he does a briefing to London MPs of some of the issues in terms of as legislation gets presented, or we do something direct. We'll talk about that. But I think we need to lend our voice to those very areas of where there's contention. And just in my own mind, the things that we're going to track this through, the things we have to watch, we've got a process now, as imperfect as it is. We're going to have new immigration laws coming in at some time during the next year because there'll be a new Queen's speech. And then we've got the treaty negotiations, either with, if it all goes, well, it's all going wrong now, but if it all gets even worse, it's individuals or with the EU. And I just think we need to keep a track on this. So can we try and commission some work around that? We need to talk outside this meeting about you saying what briefing. It might be better if we can work out if it's better if it comes from the Mayor to the MPs or not, or we talk direct to them as well. Okay, can I thank you very much in the way that you've answered the questions and shared your experiences with us. So we're very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
very
again.
much.
We will return, I think, to this subject. We just have another pause where our next guests come down and join us at our debate. Can I welcome our next guests? And if I can, introduce them in the order that I've got laid down in my notes. We are going to deal with this session is the effects of the UK's exit from the EU upon the London labour market and employers, and particularly we have a number of guests with a wide-ranging experience and some where we're going to own in into specific sectors. So welcome to Tony Wilson from the Director, Institute of Economic Studies, Ian Robinson, Partner, Fragomen, and then Charlotte Rogers, International Policy Manager, Royal College of Nursing, and then Caroline Wilfield, Assistant Director, NHS Employers. So can I begin? Now we've got about 8 questions, and I think we're going to direct them not sometimes to all, so we'll direct them to the various people. So if I go to Tony, Caroline, and then Charlotte, how important are employees who are EU nationals in the London economy? You know, in terms of paint us a picture about their importance to it, what they're contributing, where the sectors are generally, and then less only in some specific issues.
I'm very happy to go first. Thank you, Chair. So European nationals, EEA nationals, I say EU nationals for these purposes, are really important to the London labour market, more important in London than any other region in the UK. So around 1 in 6 of London's workforce are from the European Union or the EEA. That's the best part of 1 million workers. And that compares with about 1 in 15 workers nationwide being EU nationals. So anything that is bad for kind of EU nationals or bad for the employers of EU nationals will be particularly bad for, will be particularly keenly felt, particularly sort of badly felt in London. Now, EU nationals on the whole tend to work in jobs that are a bit less skilled and a bit less well paid than the non-EU, or certainly than UK nationals, I should say. They're often overqualified for those jobs, actually, but they tend to be younger workers and in less well paid roles, and in particular that means they're more likely to be in roles in, for example, food manufacturing, in the hospitality sector, in social care, in transport and logistics, in agriculture and associated jobs as well. And London is more or less reliant on workers, or has more or less employment of those workers in different sectors, different occupations. So, for example, agriculture isn't a sector at all that London is reliant on, but of course we're indirectly reliant on agriculture. Our restaurants, our retail sector, and everything else. So actually things that affect the agriculture sector are still keenly felt in London. If the costs of input prices in restaurants go up, then that has negative effects, for example. But in London in particular, you've got relatively more employment, often in higher skilled occupations. So I'll come back to those in particular, but similar proportions to the UK as a whole in, for example, mainly in the sort of hospitality industry, transport and storage, and in construction. So these are still quite big numbers though. So construction, as an example, is a sector where EU nationals are particularly important. It's about 350,000 workers in London, not all EU nationals, but in total 350,000 workers in London work in construction. So that's quite a significant chunk of the workforce. About 400,000 work in accommodation and food processing. So it's in particular, accommodation and food, so in particular the sort of hospitality industry. The other observation I make about EU nationals, though, is that, of course, London's got also a very highly skilled workforce and a very well-paid workforce, a lot of professional jobs. So about 2/5 of all employment in London is in the top 3 occupational groups. So around management and leadership roles, professional roles, and sort of senior roles in firms. Although EU nationals don't necessarily represent a large proportion of those workers, they still play a really important role in those sectors. And the obvious example in London is, of course, is financial services, but equally as associated professions as well that are related to that, around things like consulting or engineering or legal services or architecture and so on and so forth. And a lot of those jobs are far harder to find replacement demand for, if you like, and those were at a particular skill shortages, and where the benefits of migrant workers in particular on sort of bringing new skills, on innovations, on high productivity can be really keenly felt. And it's worth saying London generally has more EU nationals that come from the old EU 14, as it were, rather than the accession states, than other regions, and EU 14 nationals get paid higher, have higher average wages than UK nationals, let alone than other nationals. So it's quite so London's is reliant on European labour, and European workers are a really important part of the labour force in London. That will particularly be felt in lower paid sectors, but we shouldn't overlook the really important part that they play as well in what drives London economy and around higher skilled and professional roles.
Caroline, for the NHS.
So from the NHS perspective in London, like my colleague said, huge value that individuals contribute to the health services, and I suppose it's slightly different in a way that a lot of the people who've come in are in more regulated professional roles, whether they're doctors, nurses, other allied health professionals, as well as then our clinical support staff. So just in terms of some numbers, there's around 65,000 known EU nationals working in the NHS across England. Around 21,000 of those, so around about a third, are based in London. So a significant proportion of the overall EU workforce in the NHS. Around 20,000 nurses across the UK are of EU national status, and 36% of those work in London. With doctors, it's a slightly different position. So there are around 11,000 across England doctors working in the NHS. And unlike other professional groups, it's probably an equal proportion in London as there are in other parts of the country. But still probably with EU and non-EU nationals, around about 25% of the workforce is from outside of the UK trained doctor population. And then the clinical support staff, so those individuals who provide those valuable services in support of nurses, scientists, allied health professionals. There's around 25% of those who are hands-on clinical staff are from the EU and non-EU working in London. So high proportions of our workforce in the NHS organisations in London are from either the EU or outside of that. And I suppose that's reflected in the amount of work that the major employers have done with those staff when since the vote in terms of trying to support people through the process of getting EU settled status.
Okay. Charlotte.
Hello, I'm obviously here to represent the voice of the Royal College of Nursing, and we have around 435,000 members. The largest cohort of those are nurses, but we do also have midwives and healthcare assistants as well. So it's quite important to reflect those differences, and I'd echo what both my two colleagues to my left have already said in relation to the numbers and the reliance that we have had traditionally on recruitment from the EU and the impact that will have. But I'd also like to draw your attention to the significant decline in numbers of EU registrants in terms of the registered nursing and midwifery workforce since the referendum result in 2016. So that is a 90% fall in new registrants since then, and also we're seeing a number of already established EU nurses and midwives leaving the workforce too. I think Caroline might have already touched on this in relation to the social care workforce. They are heavily reliant on the EU workforce. I think it's something like 14% in England. So I think it will be quite an important area of focus.
Okay. Ian, I don't want to leave you out. Is there anything you want to say on anything that you just heard?
Everyone was excellent. Tony's points were very well made. We tend, when we think about this, to group workers into skilled and low skilled. And we do that for two reasons. Firstly, because that's how the immigration system conceives as workers. They're either skilled or they aren't. But also because, as Tony said, the EU14 will tend predominantly to be in higher skilled jobs, EU8 to be in, and others to be in lower skilled jobs. Really importantly, within all of this, we can't forget that the skills needs and labour needs of employers can dovetail. So just because a person is in what would be considered a lower skilled job doesn't mean that the value that they're bringing is not skills. So I think about retail and language, for instance. Sales and language. Sales jobs may not qualify in the new system in certain circumstances. You still want to employ Europeans because you're selling to Europe. Language is not always given the prominence it deserves in these conversations.
Okay, thank you for that. Tony, just go back on to the effect on the employers' recruitment then, since all this sort of stuff has been going on since the 2016 vote. What impact we've heard in the NHS, and we return to the NHS, about retention and all the rest of it. What have you been picking up about the employers and their experiences and the challenges here?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I think the answer varies hugely. We've talked to employers, particularly in the aftermath of the recession, in a state of sort of panic and confusion and anxiety, followed by sort of paralysis, I suppose, because of the uncertainty about what will happen next, inertia, sort of withdrawal, not doing anything, and through to not frankly caring, feeling like the impacts will not be significant for them, or the impacts on their workforce may not be significant, but they may see impacts through their supply chains or through their ability to buy goods or how they trade and so on. So we published with CIPD a sort of guide to workforce planning two years ago, specifically around sort of the Brexit implications and what that means for the workforce. And I think where this has been done better by employers, it's tended to actually act as a spur for employers to think proactively about workforce planning in a way they've not really had to actually in recent years, because of the ready access of the ready availability of labour, not just from Europe, but actually because we've had a labour market coming out of the recession where unemployment was a bit higher, and where there was quite a large pool of workers sort of looking for work. So this has acted as a spur, and we talk about in that guide about some of the employer responses to that, around looking at job design, looking at how their recruitment channels, looking in particular at retention. I would single out retention as really important here, because part of what drives recruitment in low-paying roles is turnover as much as it is increasing demand. It's replacement of people rather than expansion of those sectors. So like some surveys pointing to turnover within the care sector of up to half of workers leaving in the first year, and hospitality a third of workers leaving. So things that can reduce turnover can also help to manage those risks. So I think it's employers, I think, haven't. There's no sort of consistent response from employers, and it's really varied. And I think for the most part, employers, have often just been waiting and seeing, looking at their workforce plans and trying to build resilience and contingencies for if and when the withdrawal agreement kicks in. Of course, the transition period, there'll be no change, and then the subsequent deal, we'll find out what happens. Now, I would say the main impact, though, of Brexit in terms of the availability of labour, EU nationals' willingness to come and work here, or people who are here to stay here, has been indirect. It's been the depreciation of sterling. It's been the fact that the pound is worth a lot less now. And you can see that, I think, in particular, with A8 migration, which has fallen quite a lot, whereas A2, Romanian Bulgarian migration, has risen hugely. It's virtually doubled since 2016, because the pound is still so valuable. So the difference between the value of the pound and currencies in Romania and Bulgaria is still so significant. So, and you look at headline terms, the employment level of EU nationals in the UK is higher now than it's ever been, actually. So at headline terms, there was a little dip 2016, it then rose again, it then dipped a little bit more, but now we're up at 2.4 million. So there are specific sectors, nursing is a really good example, where there are really acute pressures, and where people are simply leaving the country or not, or new nurses aren't registering. But at an overall level, actually, EU migration and the number of workers in the UK is holding up, and it's actually been going up in the most recent data.
Well, thank you for that. Let's move back to Caroline and Charlotte. So the impact on, it's interesting. So we've heard the people leaving and going. You are truly an international recruiter in terms of the NHS, I think, in terms of where it goes. So what's been that impact then? How has the NHS handled some of those issues? Is it preparing, as others are preparing, for those challenges for the future? What's the predictions for different parts of the NHS? What are they predicting next year or in future years?
Okay, do you want me to go first? Okay, thank you. So there's different planning around different professional groups, and then some overall planning that wraps us all around it. And you've got planning done at individual organisational level within London, then planning with organisations within a particular place. So you've got these sustainable and transformation partnerships, so organisations that are located in an area alongside other health organisations and social care organisations. So they've been looking at the planning and the risks as applied to that place. And then you've got Planning Pan-London, which sort of is done by Health Education England and drawn together on a Pan-London basis. So the different levels of professional organisation, local system and London are pretty robust. As Charlotte said, within nursing, we've seen the numbers of new recruits declining since the time of 2016, around the time of the vote, and there's a number of reasons why that might be the case, but they've not picked up. For medical recruitment, doctor recruitment, those numbers have stayed fairly stable, and there's been some small decline within some organisations in London around the doctor recruitment, but largely they've stayed fairly static. What we have seen since 2015-16 for nursing doctors and to some extent the allied health professionals is much more recruitment outside of the EU. So to point around the global recruitment, some of the changes that we've seen happen are much more nurse recruitment from within the Philippines and from within India, and doctor recruitment from countries across the globe. And some of the statistics that have been published by the regulators for both the Nursing and Midwifery Council and the General Medical Council really starkly show that not just in London but across the country, the numbers increasing quite dramatically for rest of the world recruitment. And I suppose what our employers in London are saying to us is we want to be able to do both going forward. So whatever system we have as we exit the EU needs us to enable us to attract the talent and people into the roles that we need filling, whether they are doctors or whether they are care workers. And that future immigration system is the bit which is, I suppose, the real critical point in planning for the future. So you can make some assessments and judgments about what to do now to retain the people that you've got. You can make some judgments and adjustments to try and recruit from outside of the EU if you can't find the nurses from within the EU. But then what will happen from January 2021 when we have a new immigration system? Will it enable us to recruit the sorts of people that we can recruit now? So our planning is robust for the short term, but really reliant on a future immigration system that enables London to attract that talent.
I recognise that the NHS will always have to do that, but so I meet young people and we talk about different careers and choices, and we talk about the NHS, and they always say, well, I can't be a doctor, or I don't want to be a nurse, right? The perception around that. But they never think of any of the other careers within the NHS, and they are decent, well-paid jobs, and all the rest of it. Why, is it, what we do, if anything about the NHS as a sector, we come on about decision makers and the national situation, what is it about, what are we doing to make it a career of choice for already residents here in the UK? Do you know what I mean? Young people and whatever, because I'm always shocked by that.
Okay, so I think that both nationally, regionally and locally within London, there's an awful lot of work going on to promote the NHS, but also separate campaigns to promote social care, and those have been centrally funded and much requested, and then please they're there. So both for the NHS and for social care. There's an awful lot of work that London employers are doing to engage with their local communities and through schools and colleges to raise the profile of the range of different roles within the NHS. And I think that although we absolutely need to articulate the need for a future migration system that supports London's needs and the wider NHS's needs, there is a significant proportion of the workforce who are British and who are local. So although the proportion in London is higher than in other parts of the country, it's still the majority are people who live and work in London and are UK nationals.
But it is always going to be a sector that is going to rely partly on skills of attracting, needs a proper migration strategy because to fill the gaps, because there will always be gaps.
Yeah, and that workforce supply plan is multifactorial, and international recruitment, whether that's from the EU or outside of the EU, is part of that. But the local community engagement, making sure we've got training opportunities in place for people, both to go through the professional routes, whether that's nursing or medics, dentists, pharmacists, but all their routes into employment where there are apprenticeships to support people to learn, train and progress, and making sure that some of those policies that we have wrapped around those other government intentions to increase skills work for employers, to enable us to really sort of mobilise suppose, and increase the number of apprenticeships that are available to people.
Charlotte,
At the moment, that's quite difficult.
Thank you.
I think I'd just add to that specifically from the nursing workforce perspective, just because it's acknowledged that the nursing workforce shortages are by far the worst of any of the healthcare professions at the moment. And I think that it comes from a long-standing history of failure of adequate workforce planning at a national level, and that there have been a lot of different, quite complicated compounding factors to why we've ended up in the situation that we have done in terms of our domestic supply. I think that it's widely acknowledged as well that plugging shortages with international immigration is a short to medium term solution, and actually what we really need is to underpin those plans with better workforce planning, which I think our national bodies are certainly committed to, and there's a lot of work already underway, as Caroline mentioned. Touching on the point about why domestic population might not be as attracted, I wouldn't want to surmise, but what we do know is that the bursary for nurses was removed, and there has also been a lack of investment in education and training and CPD for the nursing workforce, and so the RCN calls upon the government to make the investment in those areas to try and boost that domestic supply. But we, as you have already highlighted, cannot ignore that we are reliant on our international staff. We very much value them. Health doesn't respect borders. It's really important that we have a diverse workforce, that we share our nursing expertise across the globe, and that must continue. So I think as we've begun to discuss, the future immigration system is a really, really important element if we're able to, so that we're able to recruit the kind of numbers that we will require in the next 5 years to come, for example.
I suppose we would have been asking this question anyway, but I would have thought Brexit puts more of a pressure on. So this is to all of you, really. It's about the impact of skills gaps and skills shortages, vacancies on the London economy. But it also says, you know, why do we continue to do more of the same in our skills, in some of our workforce planning or our skills preparation? Our colleges still do the same, our universities are still doing the same in terms of dealing with some of those issues. So start with you, Tony. I'll bring in Ian, and then we'll go back to Caroline and Charlotte.
Well, I think, yeah, this is, I think you're right, and it comes back to the point I was making earlier, that if Brexit has done anything positive in this space, it has been to stimulate a renewed focus on workforce planning and workforce strategy, which has been, which has been lost over the last 10 years. And that's not just because of EU migration. It's also because there's been a period where there's been a ready supply of labour, and now we've got a really tight labour market. So so again, notwithstanding what happens with Brexit, employers are having to do more to retain staff, to sell their employee value proposition, as they'd call it, sell the benefits of working somewhere, to improve the quality of work, improve the effectiveness of management relationships and support, to take a longer term view. I mean, I think in that sort of earlier discussion, the NHS health is a special case, and always has been, and always needs to be an international strand to that workforce strategy. But equally, it's as Charlotte says, it's something where with a bit better medium and longer term planning and a bit more drive behind that, and in particular looking at bursaries, looking at access to the apprenticeship, the extent to which apprenticeship levy can be used through supply chains and through partner organisations, and flexibilities around that, so it isn't all required to be spent on apprenticeships, for example. Looking at how we can make more attractive those routes in sort of class-based or college-based education too. Should all play a really important role, and would be really important. So that sort of critical importance of workforce planning and doing things a bit differently in the future is going to be really important. Just a final point I make is also around the importance of kind of what we call like active labour market policies to support disadvantaged groups. So in particular people with health conditions and disabled people, also many ethnic minority groups, and people with the lowest qualifications who often find themselves sort of locked outside work. So there's a lot more we can do to bring those groups into the labour market, even with low unemployment. We've still got 2 million people who are out of work due to ill health. And of all of those who are economically inactive, there's about 2 million people who say that they want to work, but they're not currently able to or getting the support they need.
Ian, have you got a view?
Well, it's funny because I worked for the Home Office for 9 years before joining Fragomen, and I ended my time there in charge of economic migration strategy and policy, so work permit policy and a few other things. The question you just asked is very similar to the question we would ask of the economic departments in every meeting that we sat with them, where they would complain about our immigration policy and we would complain about their skills policy. Essentially, from my perspective now, I do see working with clients an awful lot happening on workforce planning, on retention, an awful lot of time being spent on the future of work and how they can improve their offer, both in terms of attracting and retaining people, but also creating more flexible systems to get the work done. I'm having lots of conversations with clients about how they can reach harder to reach groups, so older workers, women returners, ex-offenders. On various focus groups, we've heard lots about children coming out of schools and how they could be more better prepared to enter the labour market. But it does feel, it's not the best answer, but it does feel to me like these conversations have been going on for the last 12 years that I've been concerned with this particular subject, and not a great deal has changed. It feels to me like there will always be a case, especially at the moment when the labour market is tight, for migrant workers. And where that is the case, we need an immigration system that works. And broadly speaking, our system is at least as good as most others in the world, but it's going to be put to the test from 2021, really.
Sure, yeah. Only to my colleague, Tony Devonish, to continue.
Thank you, Chair. My first 3 questions are to Ian. What is the UK government planning in terms of future immigration system, and how will this affect employers, please?
So, broadly speaking, the UK government's plan is that European and non-European workers from the beginning of 2021 will be treated more or less equally in the immigration system. I say more or less because there will be differences. It will be slightly easier for countries where the government considers their nationals to be of a lower immigration risk, less likely to abstain, overstay and so on. That system will be built around the foundation of the current UK points-based system, but it will actually be a lot more flexible and quicker than what we have at the moment. Essentially, if you want to employ somebody for over 2 years, they will need to be in a skilled job, and skilled will be set at A-level level. At the moment, they would need to be paid at least £30,000, although that salary, I believe, is likely to go down based on the fact that the Migration Advisory Committee are looking at it. And they will need to be sponsored. They will need to have a job offer, or at least an employer who will act as a sponsor, even if they are self-employed. For people who will be coming in but not managing to tick those boxes, they will be limited to 2 years, so long as they are aged 18 to 30 and from a youth mobility country. So youth mobility is such countries as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, 1 or 2 others, and we expect it to be extended to all European countries, especially if we have a deal. If we don't have a deal, it may just be a selection of European countries. That's a little bit unclear at the moment. If they do not tick those boxes, they may qualify for a 1-year short-term work visa, where they will be able to take low-skilled work or indeed high-skilled work, employed or self-employed. But they will need to be from a country where the UK has struck a trade agreement that allows for 1-year entry for work purposes. We can imagine that Europe will be on the high on the list for the UK. I can imagine from having been involved in GATS mode for the immigration elements of free trade agreements, discussions before now, that the Indian government, the Chinese government and others will be interested in similar arrangements with us as well. That's broadly how it will work. The final point is that it will remain as expensive as it is at the moment, so if we were to sponsor Caroline, and I don't think this is correct, but if you were married with 3 children and coming for 5 years, that would be £21,000 in government fees. If you were single and coming over for 3 years, that would be £4,500 in government fees. And then finally, whereas now it would take us 6 months to sponsor a person for the first time, 4 months if they're a permanent hire, and we've already sponsored in the past. In future, we believe the system will be such that it will take 3 weeks, so it will be an awful lot quicker and an awful lot slicker than it is at the moment.
Thank you. And how can employers ensure they have made the necessary preparations to ensure that they continue to have access to the people with the right skills required for their organisation, please?
So it's funny, I was listening to, I think it was Tony again, answer earlier about how companies are preparing. Frankly, we act for an awful lot of companies inside and outside of London, right around the world. Very few have the time to prepare for it at the moment. They're busy planning for no deal, planning for protecting employee welfare and settled status and so on. If they want to be ready for it, then the first job is to understand the jobs that your European workers are doing. That's quite difficult because very few companies record nationality in Workday or their HR systems. So there is generally an exercise to work out who you're employing in the first place. Very difficult if you're in a big company. Having understood the jobs that they are doing, the next question is, are you employing them because of skills and labour shortages, or is it just it was convenient and you quite like them? For those jobs where you're employing them because you absolutely need Europeans to do that work, there needs to be an assessment of will they qualify for a work permit in future? How long will they be able to come in for? What will you need to pay them? How long will it take to recruit them? And how long will they be able to stay for? They then need to build in the costs so that they understand they can plan their budgets in future. So an awful lot of work that frankly isn't happening at the moment, largely because of the inherent uncertainty of Brexit.
Thank you. And how will EU citizens who work in London but live in another EU state have their livelihoods and businesses protected?
I thought Luke was excellent discussing this earlier too. Essentially, I have an awful lot of conversations about this, and you tend to find that if you are living in France and working in London, it doesn't tend to be junior people. It tends to be the people running organisations. Essentially, the advice would be that they ought to apply for settled status if they qualify, but more often than not pre-settled status. To qualify, they simply need to be able to demonstrate that they're in the UK, not necessarily even residing. They then need to be able to ensure that when they hit the 5-year mark for residence, they have spent sufficient time to be able to justify full settled status, and that will mean that they must not have spent more than half of any year outside of the UK, although there is an exception for 1 year where they can be out for a good reason, including assignment sickness and so on. So essentially it's planning and monitoring absences and making sure that you don't fall foul of those rules.
Thank you. And my final question is for everybody. What's your one specific ask for the Mayor to go further in supporting London employers preparing for Brexit? Charlotte, you'd like to start?
Could you come back to me?
Tony?
Well, I think actually picking up a point that Ian made about what employers are doing right now, I would say right now the most important thing is, in fact it was the earlier panel discussion too, is ensuring that people who are currently resident here and working here are applying for and getting their right to work and their right to reside. And I think I think employers play a really key role in this. And ourselves as an employer, we've asked ourselves this question. What are we doing to make sure that people who work for us who are non?
Yeah, but what do you want the Mayor to do, though?
I think as part of, for example, the employer charter that the Mayor's leading, the Good Work agenda, I think why not put that in there too? Why not ask employers who are signing up to that charter to make a commitment about what they're doing to make sure that their employees who are non-UK EU nationals are registering, and why not put that on that page, on the web page, on those resources? Because I think that's been really welcome initiative, and I think you could use that.
Thank you, Caroline.
I'm going to pick social care. So advocating for the ability for social care employers, not just in London but across the country, to be able to access the labour that they need in roles which do not pay anywhere near £30,000 and do not require the individual to have a high qualification. So even if we get some adjustment from the Migration Advisory Committee work that's going on there, we don't see that would help social care employers. And although I'm here representing the NHS, it has a significant impact on the whole sector if that bit of our sector does not work. So I'll have to apologise to my NHS organisations, but that would probably be my number one priority for them.
Thank you.
Immigration
Ian?
system that works for them.
Yeah, I was thinking almost exactly that. The care point really worries me, because unless they are aged 18 to 30, they're not going to be able to stay for more than a year, and even then, they could be prevented depending on free trade agreements. We need a more open policy on people filling lower skilled vacancies that allows them to stay for longer. Otherwise, the construction industry will struggle, the hospitality industry, the care industry, maybe not agriculture because of seasonality, but even there. We need it to be a cheaper system. It's no country in the world comes close to the cost of the UK immigration system. Australia, most expensive, is about half. Others are normally about 10% of the cost. And then going back to the points from the last panel, the declaratory system. We can't live in a world where come the 1st of January 2021, hundreds of thousands of people, huge numbers in London, are here illegally, and all the uncertainty that does to those people as individuals and to employers.
Thank you. And Charlotte?
I think mine would be a combination of all of them in that I think it's particularly important in the social care sector, where you'll often see them being the smallest employers, such as care homes, where they don't have the kind of infrastructure in terms of HR or immigration support that other larger NHS organisations might have, for example, and it would be to provide them with the kind of awareness and support that might otherwise be afforded.
Thank you. Chair?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the way you ask any questions. Is there anything else from the members? No. If there's anything else that occurs to you after, you feel free to write back to us and say, well, I wish I'd made that point or whatever. And that goes to the previous guests as well. I've got some formal business I just need to do before we wrap up, but you're welcome to leave. So can we note as a subcommittee the report and discussions and delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group leads to agree an output of this discussion? Yeah. Thank you very much. Our next meeting will be in January. I believe it's the 15th of January at 2 p.m.
I believe so, yes.
People need to check the time on that. And subject to any other guidance, well, the pre-election period will see this. January will be okay. That's definitely going ahead on the 15th. There being no any other business that I consider urgent, I now declare this meeting closed. Thank you.